My name's Clara. My life, you could say, was the epitome of ordinary, mundane to its core. That was until I met him, Iric. It all began at a work seminar, a place you'd least expect life to throw you a curveball. I wasn't on the lookout for love, let alone an affair. But there was something about Iric, an undeniable charm that I couldn't ignore. Our conversations were electric, brimming with laughter and an uncanny sense of understanding. It was as if we were tuned to the same frequency. Sometimes, in those moments, I'd almost forget that I was married to Paul, who'd been my husband for a solid decade. With Iric, everything seemed more vivid, more intense. It's funny how someone can just waltz into your life and stir up emotions you thought were dormant. Paul and I, we had a comfortable relationship, the kind that's warm but perhaps lacking sparks. Don't get me wrong, I loved him in my way, but with Iric it was different. He was like a breath of fresh air, a secret escape from my everyday life. I found myself eagerly anticipating our next meeting, which was quite a departure from my usual routine of work, home, sleep, and repeat. One day, after the seminar sessions, Iric and I ended up at the same coffee shop. It was unplanned, or so I thought. We chatted over coffee, and before I knew it, hours had slipped by. There was an ease to our conversation, a natural flow that was hard to come by. We talked about everything and nothing, our jobs, our hobbies, and even our dreams, which seemed to align in a strange sort of way. As I drove home that day, my mind kept replaying our conversation. I was drawn to him in a way that scared me a little. I mean, I was a married woman, and here I was, feeling giddy about another man. It felt wrong, but at the same time, it was exhilarating. The seminars continued over the next few days, and so did our coffee rendezvous. With each meeting, I could feel the lines blurring. I was stepping into dangerous territory, and a part of me knew it. Yet, there was another part, a reckless part, that wanted to see where this path would lead. Iric was charismatic, to say the least. He had a way with words, a kind of poetry in his speech that made even the mundane seem magical. He listened intently when I spoke, making me feel like I was the only person in the room. It's strange, how starved you can be for attention without even realizing it. One evening, as we were saying goodbye, our hands lingered a bit too long. That touch was electric, sending a jolt through my entire body. It was a wake-up call, but not the kind that stops you. Instead, it urged me further down a path I knew was wrong but couldn't resist exploring. Looking back, I can see how I got swept away, but at the moment, all I could think of was Iric and the way he made me feel. It was like I was living in a bubble, detached from reality, from my commitments. It's funny how life can be upended by something as simple as a chance encounter. And that's how it began. An affair that would change everything. I had no idea then how deeply it would affect my life, the lives of those around me. If I had, would I have stopped? I like to think I would have, but deep down, I know the truth. I was already too far gone. So, it started off innocent enough, a coffee after work, then dinner. Sounds pretty standard, right? But one night, things shifted. We crossed a line. I kept telling myself it was just a fleeting madness, a little detour from real life. Boy, was I wrong. Iric and I began seeing each other more often. It was like I was under some sort of spell. I'd find myself waiting eagerly for his texts, his calls, the next time we would meet. It was a thrill, this secret we shared, hidden from the rest of the world. I felt alive, vibrant, feelings I hadn't experienced in a long while. Meanwhile, back at home, things with Paul were different. He seemed distant, or maybe I was the one pulling away. He started asking questions, the kind that have layers beneath them. He noticed my frequent absences, my mind being somewhere else even when I was right there. I became an expert at dodging questions and spinning stories. Just a lot of work, I'd say, or, I'm just tired, that's all. But each life felt like a tiny betrayal. It's weird how you can feel your heart squeeze in guilt, yet find yourself unable to stop what you're doing. Iric was like a drug to me. Whenever I was with him, it was like being in a different world, a world where only the two of us existed. We'd meet in these out-of-the-way places, always cautious. But that caution, that risk, it only added to the excitement. I remember this one evening. We had dinner at this cozy little restaurant tucked away in the city. It was like we were in our little bubble. The conversation flowed, the wine was perfect, and for a moment, I forgot everything, my marriage, my responsibilities, all of it. The more time I spent with Eirik, the more I craved his presence. It was a heady feeling, being wanted like that, feeling that rush of anticipation. But it wasn't just physical. We connected on so many levels. We talked for hours about our hopes, our dreams, the things that scared us. He understood me in a way I hadn't felt understood in years. But every time I went back home to Paul, guilt washed over me. He was the same kind, loving man I'd married. And here I was, sneaking around, lying to him. It was a mess, and deep down, I knew it. But somehow, I couldn't bring myself to stop. You might wonder why I didn't just end things with Paul if I was so enamored with Eirik. I've asked myself that too, more times than I can count. I guess I was scared. Scared of hurting Paul, scared of the unknown, scared of admitting that I'd strayed so far from the person I thought I was. So, I continued this double life, juggling between the thrill of my secret affair and the increasingly fragile facade of my marriage. It was exhausting, living a lie, but at that moment, it felt like the only way. Little did I know, it was a house of cards, ready to tumble down at the slightest touch. And as these things tend to go, the truth was inching closer, ready to shatter the illusion I'd built around myself. But back then, caught up in the whirlwind of my affair with Eirik, I was blind to the storm that was brewing on the horizon. As time went by, Paul started getting more and more suspicious. It was like he could sense something was off, even if he couldn't put his finger on it. He'd find excuses to check my phone or casually ask about my schedule, his eyes searching for something, anything, that might confirm his doubts. The guilt was eating at me. I was constantly torn between the guilt of lying to Paul and the excitement I felt with Eirik. Every time Paul looked at me with suspicion, I felt this pang in my heart. I knew I was betraying his trust, the years we'd spent building our life together, but I couldn't bring myself to end things with Eirik. Then, one day, it all came to a head. Paul confronted me. It wasn't dramatic or anything. He's not that kind of guy. He just calmly asked if I was seeing someone else. His voice was steady, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. It was heartbreaking. I denied it, of course. I told him he was imagining things, that it was just the stress from work getting to me. But as I spoke those lies, I could feel the distance growing between us. It was like I was watching our relationship crumble right before my eyes, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. Deep down, I knew I was losing Paul's trust. How could I not? I was lying straight to his face, and he had always been good at reading me. We'd been together for so long. He could tell when something was up. I guess I just hoped he'd believe the facade I was putting up. Living with that kind of guilt and fear is exhausting. I was always on edge, constantly worried that Paul would find out or that Eirik would slip up and expose our affair. It was like walking on a tightrope, trying to balance two completely different lives. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering what I was doing. Why was I risking everything for this affair? But then, I'd meet Eirik, and it was like all those doubts and worries would just melt away, at least for a little while. It was a temporary escape, a way to forget about the mess I was making of my life. I think part of me was also scared of what it would mean to end things with Eirik. It wasn't just about the affair or the excitement. I had developed real feelings for him. He was more than just a fling. He had become a significant part of my life, someone I cared about deeply. But with each passing day, the strain of leading a double life was getting to me. I was becoming more paranoid, more anxious. I'd jump every time my phone rang, or if Paul asked me something out of the ordinary. I was living in constant fear of being found out. And then, there were the little things that started to add up. Paul becoming more withdrawn, the occasional awkward silences, the way he'd avoid making eye contact. It was like he knew, even if he didn't want to admit it. Our relationship was on thin ice, and I was the one with the hammer. It's strange how you can be aware of making a huge mistake, yet feel powerless to stop it. I knew I was hurting Paul, possibly ruining our marriage, but I felt trapped in this cycle of lies and deception. The affair with Eirik had started as a thrill, an escape, but it had quickly turned into a web that I couldn't seem to break free from. I guess that's the thing about affairs. They start as a small diversion, something exciting and new, but before you know it, they grow into this huge, complicated mess that affects everyone around you. And the worst part? You feel too deep in it to find your way out. Alright, so after about 3 months of this whole affair thing with Eirik, I made a decision that, honestly, looking back now, feels like a whole different lifetime. I decided to leave Paul. Yeah, I know how it sounds. I was choosing the guy the first was having an affair with over my husband of 10 years. It was a painful choice, sure, but at that moment, being with Eirik made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I thought Eirik and I had a future together. Every time I was with him, it was like being in a different world. A world where I felt understood, valued, and yes, deeply loved. He had this way of looking at me, like I was the only person who mattered. I got caught up in that, in the fantasy of it all. Telling Paul was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The look on his face when I told him, it's something that still haunts me. He was shocked, hurt, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. He couldn't understand how our seemingly happy life together had led to this. And, to be honest, part of me couldn't understand it either. Paul asked if there was someone else. I couldn't lie to him anymore, not when everything was coming to an end. So, I told him about Eirik. That was even harder than the initial confession. Paul didn't get angry or shout. He just looked broken. And that broke me even more, knowing I was the cause of his pain. After the confession, I moved out. It was surreal, packing up 10 years of my life into boxes, leaving behind the home Paul and I had built together. I remember walking through our house, looking at all the memories, pictures on the walls, little knickknacks we'd collected on trips, our favorite mug set. It felt like I was leaving a huge part of myself behind. Moving in with Eirik was exciting, but also terrifying. It was the start of something new, but it was also stepping into the unknown. We were no longer sneaking around. We were out in the open, trying to build a life together. It felt different, more real, and a lot scarier. I remember lying awake some nights, wondering if I had made the right choice. I had left a stable, comfortable life for something that was uncertain. Eirik was amazing, sure, but we were still getting to know each other outside the bubble of our affair. Real life has a way of bursting bubbles. Eirik was very supportive during the whole transition. He understood that it was a huge change for me and did everything to make it easier. We would spend nights talking about our future, making plans, dreaming together. It was beautiful in a way, but there was always this nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Had I really done the right thing? The first few weeks were a blur of emotions. I was adjusting to this new life while still processing the end of my marriage. I missed Paul in a weird way. Not just him, but the familiarity of our life together. But every time I doubted my decision, Eirik was there, reassuring me, making me feel loved and wanted. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. Just when I thought I was starting to settle into this new life with Eirik, reality came crashing down in a way I never expected. It turns out, I didn't know Eirik as well as I thought I did. And that realization changed everything, yet again. You see, when you make a decision that big, you tell yourself it's for the best, that you're moving towards happiness. But sometimes, happiness is a tricky thing. It's elusive, and what seems like a step towards it can turn out to be a leap into something else entirely, something you never saw coming. So, here's where things really hit the fan. Just when I thought I was getting my life on track with Eirik, the truth came out in the most unexpected and painful way. Turns out, Mr. Perfect, Eirik, was married. Yep, you heard that right. Married, with kids no less. His wife, who was often away for work, had no clue about us. I mean, talk about a plot twist. I was floored. How could I have been so blind? All those times we spent together, all our plans and dreams, and not once did he mention his wife and kids. It's crazy how you can think you know someone, only to find out you've been living a lie. The way I found out was pretty mundane, actually. I stumbled upon some mail addressed to him and his wife, bills, some school stuff for the kids. At first, I couldn't believe it. I thought there must be some explanation, some mistake. But deep down, I knew. Confronting Eirik was one of the hardest things I've ever done. When I asked him about the mail, his face just dropped. For a moment, He tried to explain, to spin some story, but I could see the truth in his eyes. He was caught, and he knew it. The worst part? When Eirik realized the jig was up, he panicked. Like, full on, deer in headlights panicked. And then, just like that, he disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Just left me there alone, feeling like a complete fool. I was devastated. Not just because he lied to me, but because I'd left my husband for this man. I turned my entire life upside down for someone who wasn't even who he said he was. The guilt, the anger, the sheer embarrassment of it all, it was overwhelming. After Eirik left, I was in a daze. I kept going over everything in my mind, trying to figure out where I went wrong, how I missed the signs. But there were no clear answers, just a lot of questions and a heart full of regret. The loneliness hit me like a ton of bricks. There I was, in this apartment that suddenly felt way too big, surrounded by reminders of a relationship that was built on lies. I'd wake up in the morning, half expecting to see Eirik there, but then reality would set in, and I'd remember he was gone. I felt betrayed, not just by Eirik, but by myself too. How had I let things get this far? How had I been so naive? I thought about Paul, about our life together, and it just made me feel worse. I had thrown away something real for a fantasy. And then there was the shame. God, the shame was unbearable. I felt like everyone could see right through me, like they all knew what I had done and were judging me for it. I couldn't face my friends, my family. I felt like I had let everyone down, especially Paul. The days after Eirik left were some of the darkest I've ever experienced. I was stuck in this loop of self-loathing and regret. I kept replaying everything in my head. My marriage with Paul, my affair with Eirik, the lies, the secrecy. It was like watching a movie of my life and realizing the plot made no sense. I realized how much I had lost, not just my relationship with Paul, but a part of myself too. I had been so wrapped up in the excitement of the affair that I hadn't stopped to think about the consequences, about who I was becoming in the process. In the end, the revelation about Eirik was a harsh wake-up call. It forced me to take a hard look at myself, at the choices I had made, and the person I had become. It was a painful process, but it was also necessary. I needed to confront the truth, no matter how ugly it was. So, there I was, dumped by Eirik and separated from Paul, the guy who had loved me through thick and thin. My friends, well, let's just say they weren't exactly throwing me a pity party. And my family, disappointed doesn't even begin to cover it. I had tossed away everything for a guy who, it turns out, wasn't worth a dime. The aftermath of my decisions hit me like a ton of bricks. It's one thing to mess up your life in private, but another to have everyone know about it. The judging looks, the whispered conversations when I walked into a room. It was like I was living in a bad soap opera. Every time I bumped into someone I knew, I could see the judgment in their eyes. That's Clara, the one who cheated on her husband, they seemed to say. I felt branded, like I was wearing my mistakes for everyone to see. I wanted to shout at them, tell them there was more to the story, but what was the point? In their eyes, I was the villain of my own story. My friends, the ones I thought would stick by me through anything, began to distance themselves. Coffee dates got canceled, calls went unreturned. I guess it's true what they say about knowing who your real friends are when stuff hits the fan. And then there was my family. They were big on the whole family values thing. So you can imagine how well they took the news. My parents were heartbroken. They loved Paul like a son. My sister, who had always been my confidant, couldn't even look me in the eye. I felt like I had let everyone down, like I was a disappointment. I tried reaching out to Paul, not to get back together, but to apologize, to try to explain. But he wouldn't see me. I couldn't blame him, really. I had hurt him in the worst possible way. I left voicemails, sent texts, but nothing. Just silence on the other end. That silence was deafening. It was the sound of a door closing, a chapter ending. I spent a lot of nights alone in my apartment, just thinking about everything. I missed Paul, missed our life together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. With Eric, it had all been a fantasy, a break from reality. But you can't live in a fantasy forever. At some point, you have to come back down to earth. The worst part was the guilt. It gnawed at me day and night. I had been selfish, chasing after something new and exciting, not thinking about who I was hurting in the process. I had betrayed the person who had stood by me for years, and for what? A few months of excitement? I started to isolate myself, too ashamed to face the world. I go to work, come home, and just watch TV or stare at the ceiling. I lost interest in the things I used to love. It was like I was there, but not really, just going through the motions. The days blended into each other, each one as gray and unremarkable as the last. I was stuck in this rut, and I didn't know how to get out. It's funny how you can be surrounded by people and still feel so alone. I started to realize the full extent of what I had lost. It wasn't just my marriage or my relationship with Eirik. I had lost a part of myself, the part that believed in love and doing the right thing. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone I didn't even like. In the midst of all this, I had a lot of time to think about everything, about my marriage with Paul, my affair with Eirik, about who I was and who I wanted to be. It was a tough pill to swallow, realizing that the chaos in my life was of my own making. So, there I was, alone and full of regret, trying to figure out where it all went wrong, trying to piece together a life that I had so carelessly torn apart. It was a